Hello, I'm Thomas Montville, Distinguished Professor of Food Microbiology at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. For those of you who are curious, that's about 50 miles south of New York City. It's relevant that I'm a professor of food microbiology. I am not an ethicist who is going to lecture you on ethics, but rather I'd like to start a discussion and hope that at the end of the presentation, the moderator might have some time to continue this discussion. The discussion has started at my university because there have been students who have made errors, ethical errors, and their explanation is they just didn't know. So we've developed a program where all incoming graduate students are given some instruction in terms of scientific ethics. Now, during this discussion, I'm going to cover several topics. And ideally, if I were there in person, I would stop after each one of these and have a brief discussion of them. So, first of all, what are we talking about when we talk about ethics? And then with this background, we'll discuss how we treat data, possible ways of mistreating data, issues concerning authorship, intellectual property, plagiarism, which is a huge problem in society at large. The New York Times, the paper of record in the US, recently fired a reporter who they found was plagiarizing a series of articles in their newspaper. We'll talk about conflicts of interest, and then finally some ways that one might measure whether the conduct is ethical or not. So, we start with integrity. Integrity is a concept, just like love is a concept. Integrity is honesty, truthfulness, and accuracy. If you're not honest, you're not truthful, you're not accurate, there is no integrity, and you can't be a good scientist. Now, in science, we specifically talk about science being the search for the truth. I always tell my graduate students, the purpose of your studies is not to prove your hypothesis. The purpose of the study is to get to the bottom of things, to find out what is the truth of the matter, so that science can only be done by people of integrity. Now, ethics are situational. In Victor Hugo's great novel, turned into a Broadway play and then a movie, Jean Valjean is imprisoned for 20 years for stealing a loaf of bread. Now, is stealing good? No. Is stealing a truck full of bread to sell it on the black market acceptable? No. Is stealing a loaf of bread to feed your starving children, as Jean Valjean did, is that ethical? In my opinion, yes. Ethics are culturally biased. What might be acceptable in some countries might be wrong in the US or wrong in the global culture of science. So one of the things I hope you become aware of during this talk is, what do we consider wrong? Now, ethics can also depend on the discipline. I served for 15 years as the editor of the Journal of Food Safety. My son, of whom I am very proud, served as editor of the Duke University Law Review. We discussed one day the submission of papers, and I told him that in science, we can only submit a paper to one journal at a time. It's unethical to submit a paper to several journals simultaneously. We might submit them sequentially to Science first, and then if it's not accepted by Science, the Journal of Bacteriology, and if it's not accepted by the Journal of Bacteriology, then perhaps we would withdraw it or submit it to the Journal of Obscure Unimportant Results. My son said, "That's crazy, Dad. In law, people submit their papers to 6 or 7 journals at the same time. And then, if it's a really good paper, the journal editors fight each other to see who can accept it first. If it's a really bad paper, the editors just ignore it. And if it's, a good but not great paper, then they might have colleagues review it in the way that you do. But to do it sequentially, that would just take so much time and wasted effort. So ethics can depend on the discipline. Now, given that ethics are culturally biased and depend on the discipline, there are some universal characteristics of ethical behavior. I read these in the New York Times. The characteristics are fairness, authority, truth, and purity. If something is unfair, the student who conceived of the experiments is not listed as an author, that's unfair, and it would be considered unethical. The exercise of authority. If the professor insists on putting his friend as an author, and that person had no role in the paper, that would be an abuse of authority. On the other hand, a professor may let a student submit a paper that is really not such a good paper, and that would be too little authority. The fact that ethical behavior is truthful is self-evident. Purity, I forgot to check my thesaurus to see how we might apply that to science, but as we used to say in graduate school, it should be intuitively obvious. Now, with this background, let's look at some issues regarding data and the presentation of data. Here are common errors. The first, and perhaps the worst, is the fabrication of data. Perhaps a student forgets to run the control experiment. And the student knows, as do most of us, that in the control experiment, nothing should happen. So the student decides, since nothing should happen, they will just create nothing values, or values that show nothing happens for the control. This is fabrication of data. It's false. The second common error is the withholding of data. And this may range from not including data that don't fall on the regression line to withholding actual experiments. I had a student who was almost at the end of his dissertation, did the final nail it down completely experiment, and it disproved his hypothesis. And the student just wanted to withhold that data and finish his dissertation and leave. And in fact, several times he told me the experiment didn't work. And I let him repeat it several times until he came to the conclusion that the experiment worked, but that the hypothesis was wrong. In this case, we examined the hypothesis very carefully, developed a new, better refined hypothesis that fit all the data, and were able to move forward to advance science because we did the ethical thing. It's horrible to knowingly publish irreproducible results. There is, if you want to have some fun sometime, the Journal of Irreproducible Results. It's a parody. But publishing irreproducible results does tremendous harm both to the field and other individuals. I've had 2 instances of this. In one, we wanted to measure membrane fluidity, and there was an article published by someone I knew describing the use of differential scanning calorimetry to measure membrane fluidity. We went to great lengths to get access to a DSC instrument and couldn't make it work. We followed the procedures exactly, and we could not get any reproducible results. So finally, after 3 months of intensive work, I called who up until then had been my friend and asked him about the method. And he said, well, it's very tricky. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. So what one has to do is run the experiment many times and then pick out the data that are correct. That's wrong. That's what we call cherry picking or fruit picking, just picking the data that support the hypothesis. It wasted a tremendous amount of my time, the students' time, university resources. I also had the occasion of having a paper for making protoplasts that described exactly the reagents we had, the same genus, species, and strain, and again, we couldn't get it to work. Finally, I called the author, and the author said, well, it's an optimized method, but you have to optimize it for every batch of enzyme you get. And I said, how could you publish that? It's not an optimized method. It's an optimized experiment in your lab. And he said, well, I worked for a year on that and had to have something to show for it. So I published that paper. There's something called massaging the data. When I was a youngster and we plotted data by hand, my advisor came up to me and he saw me making these little tiny data points on a line. And he said, Montville, you have to make your points a lot bigger because then the line will be closer to the points. That's massaging the data. Or sometimes using scale effects will have the effect of massaging the data. You can see on the graph on the left, it looks like there are an increase in the value of the squares, and that the square has something happening in that treatment. But if we look at the full scale on the right, you can see that there's no change. Everything sits at 1 relative to the control, and what we have are 3 points that don't fall on the line. Now, there are also issues of interpreting data, the use of statistics, and the misuse of statistics. We have, this is something of a joke, when we say that there are people who don't tell the truth, there are people who don't tell the whole truth, and there are statisticians. And statisticians, we can manipulate statisticians to tell whatever truth we want to tell. So frequently we'll ask the statistician, what statistical help should I use? And they will answer, what would you like to prove? Now, this really isn't the statistician's fault. Unfortunately, many of us go to the statistician after we do the experiments, can't really interpret them, and need some post hoc statistical assistance. So then the statistician has to ask us, well, what are you trying to do here? Okay, so we won't condemn all statisticians, but we will call into question the misuse of statistics. Now, there's something called investigator bias. And investigator bias is basically that we see what we want to see, and we interpret data in light of our hypothesis. So when my students bring me in data that they love, but I'm not very impressed with, I remind them that every mother thinks her baby is beautiful. The mother of this baby thinks it's beautiful. But let's face it, this is an ugly baby. Now, data and ideas. Ideas can be owned. And this is an important concept. The data usually belong to the entity that provided the resource, not the individual scientists. So different entities can own the data. The company can own the data. If one works in industry, it's very clear that the company owns everything. When one leaves, the notebooks are turned into the company. If one has a patent, the company owns that patent. Usually they give the inventor a minimal amount of money and a plaque. The university owns the data for university-funded research, including patents. I cannot make a patent based on my results in the university. However, the university has a very generous policy for sharing royalties with professors. The project may own the data. And by this, I mean students come and go, and sometimes they think their data go with them or can't be disturbed or challenged by other people in the project. The principal investigator may own the data if they're doing it with their own resources on their own time. The government may own the data. In the US, all government-funded research must be published for free so that everybody can access it. Or, of course, there may be secret research. I have done research on biothreat agents, but as the saying goes, if I told you about it, I'd have to shoot you. And finally, data are rarely owned by students. We have had some ugly situations where students finish their dissertation, pack up their notebooks, and leave so that the principal investigator has no access to the original data. In this case, where there couldn't be a settlement between the student and the professor, the university stepped in and told the professor that, I'm sorry, they told the student that they had stolen the data and stolen the notebooks, and the university would cancel their degree unless they were returned. This is not a good way to do things. With almost all ethical issues, the best way to deal with them is in advance. When I give my students notebooks, I tell them, I'm giving you my notebook. I own it. I want you to put all of your data in it, all of your thoughts in it. You can make photocopies of it if you want, but at the end of your studies, you will return my notebook to me. And then it's very clear. There was a controversy at Rutgers, or actually a continuing controversy, about who should get credit for the discovery of streptomycin. Now, in the 1940s, tuberculosis was considered the Great White Plague, and there was considerable effort, tremendous effort, into finding a cure for it. So Selman Waksman, a soil microbiologist, appointed his student, Albert Schatz, to screen bacteria for the production of antimicrobials that would kill Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And Schatz went out to the field behind the laboratory and isolated an organism that killed Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and that organism produced the antibiotic streptomycin, which put an end to this scourge. For this discovery, Waksman has become famous. There's a big plaque on his laboratory. Rutgers built the Waksman Institute of Microbiology, and Waksman won the Nobel Prize. So the question then is, what about Schatz? You can discuss this. One might say that Waksman had the idea, Waksman obtained the funding, Waksman wrote out the experimental protocols and told Schatz what to do, and Waksman should get all the credit. On the other hand, people might say, well, it is Schatz who did the work, and he had the insight to go look in the field behind the lab where there were a lot of cattle grazing rather than the wheat field in Iowa. He knew how to isolate and was very good at isolating organisms, and he was able to identify the inhibition. So Schatz should really get the discovery. Now, I think most of us agree that Waxman certainly has credit for the discovery. But the current thinking is that Schatz was the co-discoverer of streptomycin. And at Rutgers now, that's always how it's presented. That Selman, Waxman, and Albert Schatz were the co-discoverer of streptomycin. Again, some of these things might be discussed in advance. I had an industrial project that ultimately led to a patent. That was the goal of the research. I explained this to the students. I told them that they would be named on the patent, but the patent would ultimately belong to the university. And it was highly unlikely they would get any money or fame. And that was okay. Now, issues of authorship. And again, these are issues that are best discussed in advance. So, in the old days, it was considered that only authors should be authors. An author should be responsible for the whole manuscript, the methods, the interpretation of data, the writing, the authors should take responsibility for everything. That was in the old days when people used typewriters. And if any of you are under 30 and don't recognize this instrument under the big nose there, ask someone who's over 50, and they will explain this to you. There are currently several factors that can entitle someone to being an author. The first is if they have the idea. If I have a really great idea and tell a student, go figure it out, come up with the experiments, design the experiments, do that study. Even though I don't want to say just had the idea, but even though that was my contribution, I should be an author. If the person obtains the funding for that specific project, it usually means that they thought of the hypothesis, had the experimental design. They would certainly be an author. If they obtained umbrella funding, for example, my dean obtains the funding for the light, the heat, the gas in my laboratory, I would argue that he should not be an author. Intellectual contributions can be very important. I've had a study where I just ran up against a wall and could not proceed to test my hypothesis. And over coffee one day, my colleague told me, well, you know, I work with protoplasts. And Dr. Ludischer upstairs works with fluorescence. And if you combine fluorescence methodology with protoplasts, you can get a whole new universe of data. And I did. And it carried my lab forward now for many years. So that professor earned a right to be an author on that paper. I offered to make him an author on the second paper in that series, and he said, no, I made one contribution. It's been acknowledged as an author. That's it. The people who design the experiments should be authors. People who do the experiments usually should be authors. Now, if again, I go to an undergraduate, say, here's the detailed protocol for the experiment I want you to do. I want you to bring me the results and so that I can interpret them, and then I'll write the paper. That student really does not deserve authorship. They should get an acknowledgement. My advisor once told me, if trained monkeys could do the experiment, they wouldn't be an author. And this undergraduate is really, let's face it, little more than a trained monkey. Don't tell the student that. Interpreting the data. could merit authorship? Probably would. Writing the paper. There have been cases where postdocs have been written. There have been cases where the student just can't write. They have writer's block. So a postdoc is brought in to go through their notebooks, discuss the experiments, discuss the data, and that postdoc writes the paper, even though they didn't do any of the above. They wrote the paper, they should be an author. People who guide the paper through publication might be authors. I've had international colleagues ask me to correct their papers for English usage. Editors aren't authors. Editors may perhaps get an acknowledgement. In other cases, a colleague has had a paper brutally rejected by a journal and asked me to look at it. And I found that they misinterpret the data. The discussion was very unclear. It contained too many extraneous experiments, and I sat down and rewrote and reinterpreted their data, contributed intellectually. We submitted it for publication, and I was listed as an author, which I think is entirely appropriate. Now, you can do this exercise on your own time or perhaps in a small group. Which of these people should be an author? I realize that in some cultures, the institute director is an author on every paper, with the rationale that the institute director is responsible for everything. Anything that happens in that institute, the director gets responsibility for. So if there's responsibility for bad things, why not get credit for good things? In the US, this would be unacceptable. And at any rate, a scientist who publishes 200 or 300 papers a year, people have a hard time believing that anyway. A professor who provides a key reagent. Now, this is not just a chemical that I don't have in stock, but perhaps a purified sample that was very difficult to get and would be key for my experiments. Maybe that professor should be an author, maybe not. These decisions are best made before the experiment. The professor says, I really need that. It would be a huge contribution. If you give me that reagent, I will make you an author. This kind of quid pro quo or payment for things or services is questionable. Okay. Analytical methods. If I have a fatty acid analysis done by a colleague, they might want authorship. But I could send the same fatty acid analysis out to an external laboratory who would do it for a fee, and they would not provide authorship. Some people consider authorship as the pay or the currency for scientific contributions. Think about these and discuss them. Now, very slippery material, copyrighted material. Copyrighted material is owned. Okay? It's owned. We can't take it or use it without violating the law. If there's a big copyright infringement, the owner of the copyright may come after us and sue us for damages. If not, we'll know in our hearts that it's wrong. So you'll notice on the first and last slide of this presentation, I note that it's copyrighted. Don't take it and use it as your own. If you do, I'll probably never know, but you'll know. And furthermore, if you ask me if you can use it, I'll tell you sure, as long as you give me some credit. Now, I'm going to move from copyright infringement, which is a legal issue, to plagiarism. And plagiarism is just when you take something, you don't say where you took it from, and you use it without permission or attribution. And I have to apologize here when I slip into you. It's a generic you. I don't mean that you would do such a horrible thing. So there are cases, and we've had this at Rutgers, and I have to say, usually when material is plagiarized, it is both taken without permission and passed off as the student's own work. Or the professors. There have been serious cases of professionals being caught plagiarizing. The New York Times, which you've probably figured out is my favorite newspaper, the New York Times fired a reporter who plagiarized several articles in a series of stories. Just a professional newspaper person plagiarizing stories. It was a scandal. That person will never work in the newspaper industry again. So, what is plagiarism? Plagiarism is theft. Okay? It's taking someone else's words or ideas and using them without permission. It presents something that one has found as their own. So, for example, if I read an article about homeoviscous adaptation, the ability of membranes to maintain their fluidity, and I brought it to an audience of physical chemists and said, well, you know, I have this great concept of homeoviscous adaptation, that would be plagiarism because I took their idea. Can words and ideas be stolen? Yes. Okay. We have had colleagues who have considered it a great homage to the author to take their work and translate it and publish it. They're actually stealing the words and ideas. So why do people plagiarize? One is they don't understand the concept of intellectual property. In the United States, when it was first settled, the settlers bought land from American Indians. American Indians just could not believe that land could be property. Land is the earth. Who could own the earth? So they took the money saying, ha ha, they're buying something that doesn't exist. So there is also intellectual property. This is a very important concept, and if people don't understand it, they could very well end up plagiarizing. Sometimes people don't know how to digest and rewrite the information, so they just use it in the form that they originally found it. And finally, and this is a challenge for many of our international students, they just lacked confidence in English usage. So, and it's usually pretty obvious because the paper will be written in adequate English, and then there will be a brilliant paragraph, a paragraph that is so good I could not have written it. And then it goes back to adequate English. So we check that paragraph against plagiarism programs and find that it's plagiarized. We confront the student, and she says, I could never say it so well. They said it so beautifully. How could I demean that concept by using my words when their words are so beautiful? And the answer to that is to put their words in quotes, make a reference, give them credit, and then that's okay. Now, there's a very tricky issue of prior publication. It is possible to plagiarize one's own work. In the old days, and you can tell my mustache is a little white, I can talk about the old days, it was considered improper to publish a paper using data presented at a meeting. This really isn't an issue anymore. There might be an acknowledgement. Some of these data were presented at the 67th annual meeting of the American Society for Microbiology. Presenting data that has been already published in a thesis can be an issue because journals may require new unpublished data and may require or may consider theses to be published. This is usually not a big consideration. At Rutgers, the university will withhold the publication of the thesis until a paper has been submitted. Even trickier, I give many conference talks. I've been asked to write a proceedings paper. If I write a proceedings paper with new data and that paper is published, I can't rewrite it to present it for a peer-reviewed journal. It's what we call double dipping. My way around this is either I tell the conference organizers that I'm sorry, I don't write proceedings papers for this reason, or I don't include any new data in the proceedings paper. Another type of self-plagiarism is when a paper is written in the native language, published there, and then subsequently translated and submitted to an English language journal. Now, I know that in many countries, it's very prestigious to publish in an English language journal, and that publishing in a regional journal may be considered a prerequisite to that. But from an ethical standpoint, this is very questionable. And at the very least, double dipping, counting the same publication twice. Now, I will admit that the American Society for Microbiology published my textbook in English and subsequently sold the rights for publication in Spanish and in China. And I do take credit for all three editions of the paper, but I'm very transparent about it. It's clear that it is the same paper. That's another way to approach ethical questions, is to be transparent. Just tell people, this is what I'm doing. And if it's all what we call above board and in the open, that can move it from being ethically unacceptable to acceptable. For example, if a company is funding a project and it's given to the student to work for free, and then the company subsequently makes a lot of money, that might be unethical treatment of the student. But if at the beginning of the project, the student is told, look, there is no pay for this project, it's not in the budget, it will give you experience in this field, you'll make connections with the company that may result in a job later on, the company may end up making money on this project, do you still want to do it? Then the student has a choice. That's an ethical way to do things. I have run up against cases as an editor where a scientist has written a chapter and then updated it very marginally, and then submitted it to my book. And this is difficult because it's a very senior colleague, and for better or for worse, one doesn't want to throw mud at someone above you, because gravity works and the mud comes down and splatters you too. So what I did was I called up the author and said, you know, this looks very much like the other chapter. If you were to publish it, it might be considered plagiarism and might reflect poorly on you. Would you like to just withdraw this chapter? And of course the author said, yes, this is a very, I think, gentle and kind way to deal with a case of plagiarism. Now, there are many different types of conflicts of interest with which ethical people have to be aware. If a company sponsors research, do they control the results and publication? Rutgers will not allow this. Rutgers does not allow a company to prevent publication of a study. For example, they might fund a study to prove the safety of their medicine, and the study shows, in fact, that the medicine is very dangerous. These are important findings. The company should not be able to stop them. The company should not be able to slant the results. So, for example, if we would say this compound is dangerous, could the company say, well, could you say this compound might be dangerous in certain circumstances? That's a conflict. Do I have a financial stake in the results? That's a conflict. There are conflicts of time. Do my outside activities compete with students for my time? Now, I consult, I edit journals, I write books, I travel internationally, and of course, when I'm doing those things, I'm not available to my students. But the university says, first of all, our policy, Rutgers policy, is that we can spend 1 day a week on outside activities. And the reason it's permitted is because these outside activities keep us current. They make contacts and relationships with companies that might subsequently fund research or hire our students. They might give us some insight into what are the real problems of this industry, or they may give us classic examples of problems that can be solved if one knows the fundamental knowledge. So outside activities might, and in many cases, are acceptable. If they interfere with the student to the point that the student cannot progress in their studies, then it's just not right. There are conflicts of resources. At Rutgers, we are not allowed to use Rutgers equipment, supplies, lab space for our own gain, to the point that we have been told not to put a link to our personal website on a Rutgers website. So on my departmental website, where there's a Thomas Montville page, I'm not allowed to put a link that directs the reader to Thomas Montville Food Science Consultant, because that's using the university's resource for my own gain. Now, on the other hand, I know of countries where, for example, salmonella testing laboratories are very rare and few and far between. And the university says to the professor, we're building you this facility. We know that you are not highly paid, as many professors are not. So we would like you to use this facility, develop it into a business, make some money on it, augment your salary, because it's for the good of the country and it's for the good of the industry, and we want you to use our facilities. And again, the key thing here is transparency. Everybody knows that it's allowed. Conflict of interest, okay? Do we keep the interest of the student foremost in mind? There may be a student who is really, really good, ready to get their PhD. And it's tempting to say, I'm going to keep you another 6 months because you're not really done yet. When in fact, I want that student for another 6 months because I'll get a lot of work out of them. That would be a conflict of interest. It could also be a conflict if there's a student who's mediocre and is not quite finished yet, and it's taking them years and years. And it would be unethical to say, well, we're going to give you your PhD and get you out of here. And it's unethical. It's not fair to the student, because people would expect them to have the qualities of a doctorate, and they wouldn't be able to do that. Many, many controversies in my department, and I'm proud to say this, many controversies are ended when somebody says, what's in the best interest of the student? That reframes the discussion. We can usually agree on what's the best interest of the student, and we use that. And then there are privacy issues. Are there any misuse of confidential information? So there are some ethical standards that we can apply. We have to be exemplary in being good. And to this end, the American Society for Microbiology has a specific code of ethics. Microbiologists should be able to uphold and advance both the profession and human welfare using our knowledge for good, not for evil. Not to commit fraud, the things we've talked about, fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism, not to have conflicts of interest. And what this really boils down to is be good, don't be evil. Now, I have two closing thoughts. The first is that unethical practices can have very bad consequences. So it would be nice to know that we're doing good for the sake of doing good, but we might also do good because doing bad will hurt us. First of all, we lose our self-respect. We know in our hearts that we did something wrong. Secondly, we lose our credibility. That scientist who cherry-picked his differential scanning calorimetry data, the one who optimized a procedure that wasn't optimized, I tell my students, don't look at their work. There are institutions where the work coming out of the institution is so poor and so unethical that I tell my students, don't believe anything that comes out of that research center. There are loss of professional standings. One will not be asked to be an editor. One will not asked to be an administrator. When I became the director of our graduate program, I asked the dean, what was the job? And she told me, the most important job of the graduate director is to protect the intellectual integrity of the program. To protect the intellectual integrity of the program. Not to make sure the students finish, not to make sure there's enough budget, not to make sure the faculty played nice, but to protect the intellectual standing. There can be loss of professional privileges. If one is caught plagiarizing, they may be prohibited from publishing in that journal again. They may be prohibited from getting grant money from that agency for the next 5 years. They may be prohibited from presenting their results at national meetings. So this is serious. They may lose their jobs. There may be unknown future impacts. Now, there are behavioral benefits to ethical behavior. First of all, ethical behavior makes life easier. If one lies, one has to remember what lie one told to what person. But if one tells the truth, there's only one version of the truth. It makes things easier. Ethical practices advance science. Science is the search for the truth. This is what I said at the beginning of the talk. And when we search for the truth, when we practice science, we ennoble ourselves. Truth seekers are truly noble people, and that's what scientists should be. And that's what we can be, and that's what we are. I have credits for all the images I've shown in this talk. Some people feel that the image credit should be right under the picture. I think that makes for ugly slides. ASM Press typically publishes image credits at the end of books or in the chapters, not under the figures. So I think if it's good enough for ASM Press, good enough for me. And finally, I'd like to tell you, contact me. If you have some questions, send me an email. If you'd like to use material from this presentation, just ask. I'll say yes. It would be nicer if you asked, would you like to come to our conference and present the material? But I understand that that's why we have a virtual speakers program. And on that note, I hope you've enjoyed this. I thank you very much. And if your language isn't on the slide, it's not intentional. Just thank you.